there are a lot of people who do not like uh, people from India, Pakistan, or Africa because of the color of their skin. It mixes up with the fact they're coming from a different culture as well. Um, and there is a fine line to be drawn between racism and xenophobia. Uh, and xenophobia, the difference problem with xenophobia or its definition is a fear of other cultures,
Right.
and racism is a fear based on race. Uh,
True.
and and I think that a lot of people who call themselves xenophobic are probably racist.
Welcome to the Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our special guest today is Tom Arms, journalist, author, and bon vivant, if that's the right pronunciation, who also happens to be an old friend of mine. And he's speaking to us all the way from London. And today we're going to be discussing migration. Tom, why we are bringing up migration is because of this recent issue with, sending people back to Rwanda and things like that. But correct me if I'm wrong, you yourself are a migrant from the US, right?
Yes, I am. I immigrated from the US, what was it, 55 years ago. And
Okay.
I'm very proud. I've written articles referring to myself as an immigrant, and I did not come from a mud hut in Africa. I came from a country club in Virginia, which is slightly different. But all the same, I do relate to people who are immigrants. They are people who have given up their family safety net. They have basically said, I'm going to risk all in a new country, which I don't know. I don't know the customs. I don't know how things work. I'm going to learn. I'm going to do my best. And they're entrepreneurs. They are people willing to take risks. And I think they are an important part of any society.
Tom, this latest issue that we are seeing now, with Rishi Sunak having to sort of overrule the Supreme Court, as it were, by passing another law and things like that. Could you help us put it into perspective? What sparked this whole thing? Is it just a question of too many illegal migrants, or is there something else?
Well, there are a lot of migrants. And the Conservative Party has been saying for years that it's going to reduce the number of immigrants coming to this country. At one point, they said they were going to get them down to under 10,000. And last year, for instance, there were 700,000. So
Okay.
obviously, they have failed. Now, a lot of these are legal migrants. But in the case of the ones who are going to be sent to Rwanda, they are illegal migrants. They are people who have climbed into small boats on the coast of France and have risked their lives crossing the channel to seek asylum in the UK. A number of them are economic migrants, let's be honest. And there are roughly about 50,000 of them a year. Now, that's 50,000 out of 700,000. So try and put it in perspective. But they are the most visible ones. And that makes them the most political migrants. And so what has happened is that they have become the focal point for the immigrant debate here in the UK.
So, Tom, the one argument says that England is an island country and we can only have so many people, otherwise we'll go nuts, we'll just have standing room only. And the other argument says that, look, we are not even reproducing enough to sort of make a workforce. Very soon we'll have a bunch of retirees. Which is the correct assessment, or is it somewhere in between?
It's obviously somewhere in between, and really it's very much a political issue. The first part of that argument, those who say, we're an island company, an island country, and pretty soon we won't be able to stand up, they are basically very socially conservative. They believe in a homogenous Britain. They feel that their culture is under threat. It's not just the jobs. It's not just the people who are going to be taking up queuing space in the National Health Service, accident and emergency rooms. It is basically people who come from a different culture and don't understand us. And they speak a foreign language, and they're not British. Oh boy! So that's that issue. Those are the socially conservative ones. On the other side are the people who tend to call themselves liberal, and they are encouraging multiculturalism. They like the idea of having a mix of cultures in the country. They like going to curry houses for dinner, and they enjoy meeting people from different societies and different countries. And there is the issue of employment. Immigrants, generally speaking, will take the most poorly paid jobs in any community. They are new to the country. They can't pick and choose the way other people can. Their children are different, or their grandchildren. They tend to be the ones who work really hard and go to university and become doctors and lawyers and things like that. But first-generation immigrants are bus drivers, they're construction workers, things like that. They're trying to get their family's foot on the ladder.
Right.
And we need people at that level, because a lot of Brits will not do that job. And we've got full employment, roughly 3% unemployment levels.
But do you personally see, let's say, the number of migrants having increased over the last few years owing to various wars and other things happening, or is this a steady trickle which just has been going on for some time?
It has increased. I mean, international relations obviously have had an impact on migrant levels. For instance, last year we took in 2 million Ukrainians, 300,000 Hong Kong Chinese. And there, in 2015, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees said there were 15 million people, displaced people, as a result of wars, famine, and things like that. In 2023, there were 86 million. And that was before we had Gaza and Sudan. So it's probably over 90 million people now, displaced people in the world. And these people are trying to survive. And they will do anything to survive. They will climb into little boats and risk their lives crossing the English Channel, the busiest shipping lane in the world.
But, given that there is already some sort of resentment brewing against all these illegal migrants who, many people say that, they come in here and they're willing to work for less than us. So obviously they're taking away our jobs and things like that. Let's not just talk about UK, but even otherwise. I mean, I'll come back to this Rwanda thing a bit later, but, even across Europe, there seems to be some sort of resentment brewing against migration. Is that a correct assessment?
It's across the entire Northern Hemisphere. It's the United States, where it is feeding the right wing, Trump populism. It is in Europe. It is one of the reasons for the rise of populism in Europe and the success of people like Viktor Orban in Hungary. You see it in Europe, and you see it in the United States. You're starting to get a fair number of immigrants in Japan. Generally, they don't have a problem as such. And I think that's partly because the Liberal Democratic Party has painted it as these people are needed not to change Japanese society, but to sustain it, to keep it going the way we want it to keep it going. And they've had some success in delivering that message. But other countries, China is going to have this problem very soon, if not already.
But it's not just the UK. I understand that Israel had at one time a policy where they had some kind of a thing where they told you that, look, we'll either give you a return ticket home, or we'll give you $3,500 and a ticket to Uganda or something. And Australia had a policy where they would send them to some, neighborhood islands and say, you wait there till we decide what to do with you. How none of those seem to have really worked out. So what makes people believe that this particular Rwanda plan will work?
Well, I personally don't think it will.
But in that case,
I think it will not work. I think that it will have also severe repercussions on Britain's standing in the rest of the world, because in order for them to send the refugees from Rwanda, they are going to have to continue to overcome a number of legal obstacles. And they're basically, the reason they have put it back to the House of Commons and changed some of the legislation is because the UK Supreme Court blocked the first sending of refugees to Rwanda. But they still have to overcome international conventions, the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Court on Human Rights. All those have yet to make a judgment on the Rwanda policy. And Rishi Sunak said just the other day, that's the Prime Minister, he said, I don't care if it comes to a choice between protecting Britain and leaving the jurisdiction of international law and international courts, I will protect Britain. Now, I think that's a terrible thing to say. You have to have the rule of international law, and you can't pick and choose. You can't cherry pick the laws you want to obey and the laws you're just going to, stick two fingers up to, or one finger.
Mm-hmm. Look, this Rwanda thing is not really something new. I believe that it was planned quite a while back, and then the government paid some £120 million or something to Rwanda. But what exactly are the contours of this deal?
They paid £450 million to Rwanda so far.
Okay.
But
what does one get in return? I mean, does that guarantee that anybody is sent to Rwanda won't come back?
The Rwandans will basically take them in and give them initially a place to live. They have built accommodation for them, but it's taken so long for the government to finally, and it still has not finally, it's taken them so long to get this policy together that the Rwandans have sold off the accommodation that they built. And so they're going to have to build new accommodation. And of course, it looks very likely, highly likely, it's almost impossible that the Conservatives, led by Rishi Sunak, are going to win the election, which has to take place before January. And the Labour Party has said that they will throw out the Rwanda policy. And so, even if they manage to get it through the courts and get a few plane loads of refugees off to Rwanda, that's all they're going to get, because it's going to be reversed by the Labour Party.
Wow. So obviously, it's a question of, if Rwanda, if it's not going to happen, you're going to be throwing good money after bad after having given Rwanda so much money.
Politics. It's politics. It's all politics.
I understand that. Politics. But there is, another thing that I noticed, in fact, the other day I was just reading something about that in Ireland, apparently, the amount of money that they give, not to, refugees like the ones that come across like that, but to people from, let's say, Ukraine. There's a gentleman who sort of let his castle out for Ukrainian refugees, but he gets money from the Irish government anyway per refugee. But Ireland has cut that money by a huge, they've really put in they've really halved it or something, or quartered of some. Is that
part of
some overall...
Ireland is beginning to get a kickback, a backlash against refugees. It's fairly recent, but the populist right is starting to grow in Ireland. It's not nearly as large now as it is in Britain or, say, Germany or even France, partly because the Irish government is flush with money. And so it can spend It can spend a lot of money on housing and the health service and things like that. So that one of the reasons why there is such a backlash against refugees in this country is because the economy is in difficulty. So the National Health Service is having difficulty. It takes 8 hours to get through the emergency ward, and people look for a scapegoat and they turn to refugees. It's the fault. It's the blame of the refugees. They're short on housing. It's the refugees are to blame. People like to have a scapegoat. What it is the economy is up the creek without a paddle.
But it's interesting. The other day I was watching some videos where you had local Britishers stopping people from actually taking some of these migrants into buses and hauling them to those boats or whatever it is that they're planning to do. So there's also a huge community which doesn't want these migrants to be deported. Who are these people?
They're people like me, to be honest. I mean, they're people who look at these migrants and say, these are people who I want in my society because they are risk takers. They are people who, are willing to work hard by and large. They haven't come over here to live off the state. As a lot of right-wing populists will say, they've come over because there are no jobs for them in sub-Saharan Africa. Their farms have been swallowed up by the Sahara Desert, or they've been forced out by a war. And they've come here because they need to survive, and they will work hard to do so. And I will exploit them. I will pay them to fix the guttering on my house.
Right. But another interesting thing that I read somewhere was that apparently because Rwanda has recently passed a law against sort of the LGBTQ crowd, that all these migrants who come here and who are afraid to be deported might just say, "Hey, look,
they're all LGBTQ now.
So you can't deport me." Is that a possibility? I mean,
well, I hope they don't have to prove it.
Yeah, well, but there are all these various things coming up. But part of the deal with Rwanda would be that all these people that we send back get some opportunity to do something in Rwanda, right? They can't be expected to just sit there in Rwanda and live off the land, as it were.
No, but Rwanda isn't exactly a country that has a booming economy with lots of opportunities, in the same as Britain does. It's not a Western country. They can't offer the same standard of living, and it's not a safe country in the sense that it's not politically stable. Their president has been there, I think, for 30 years. It is a corrupt African country. And sue me if you think they're not corrupt, but they are.
Ah, okay. But the other thing is, there some kind of a racial discrimination in terms of, let's say, refugees from Ukraine can come and stay, but refugees from Africa can't?
Oh yes, definitely. Although it's not perhaps as basically, refugees from Ukraine, people can associate with that. They are political refugees. They are seeking asylum. And there is a greater likelihood that when the war is finished in Ukraine, that they will want to return to Ukraine.
Right.
In the case of migrants from Africa or the Middle East, from Syria, say, a lot of them are economic migrants, which people feel less accommodating towards, and they are more likely to want to stay here permanently. And they've left Chad, or they've left Nigeria or Niger to seek a better life, not to seek refuge.
But another thing that has always bothered me is that all these Arab nations, if you look at Saudi Arabia and all these other rich countries, even they don't have enough youngsters to come and sort of, they depend on outsiders to come and do most of their work. So why are these refugees not going there? Or is it because they don't allow
Because they're not welcome. They're even less
Well,
welcome there, and these countries will pass laws. I mean, but having said that, as we know, the was it Qatar that hosted the World Cup? They brought in a lot of workers from South Asia to build the stadiums and the roads and everything else. They put them up in almost slave quarters, paid them almost slave wages, took away their passports, treated them like dirt, and then when when the World Cup was over, they sent them home.
That's right.
So that could be why people don't want to go there, because of the way they're treated.
Now, if let's talk it from your perspective. If you had to deal with this whole refugee problem, how would you tackle it? I mean, obviously, you can't just say anybody and everybody is welcome. There has to be some kind of a screening process, right?
Well, if I were Prime Minister, what would I do? Now, there's a question. Well, to be honest, I think you should tackle the problem at its source. You should try and increase or improve reasons for why they should stay in the country in which they were born and raised. You should invest in businesses. You should focus on globalization. I'm a great believer in globalization. You should try and increase the opportunities for them in countries like Chad, Niger, and so forth, so that they don't want to risk their lives, turn their backs on their families, and try to set up in a completely new country and culture. So that's what I would do. Instead, the British government has cut its aid program significantly, and so have a number of other European countries and the United States. Instead, they have taken that money and they focused it on trying to keep out refugees. And in fact, the money that is spent on housing the refugees when they do come into this country, they're kept in hotels. That money comes out of the aid budget.
Right, that's true. I mean, it could be, but if you look at the whole refugee issue as such, most of the refugees that come in from other places, as you said, risk their lives to come to a particular country simply because they have no other option. They always believe that anything is better than what we are facing right now. Once they arrive in places like Italy or Germany or wherever it is, they also get a lot of benefits which they wouldn't get in any other, let's say, Asian country or other country if they were to go there. Simply because those countries are not perhaps rich enough to look after their own people, leave alone refugees from other countries. Do you think there could be a process wherein you could say that, okay, a certain percentage of people we will take in who are totally impoverished, who are coming in, and we will give them a place to stay and some kind of work, and the rest will have to be educated refugees, people who come here to work?
There is some discussion along those lines. I think, Ram, maybe you should come over here to Britain and join the British cabinet, because that is being discussed not by the Conservatives but by the Labour government. Now, when Britain was part of the EU, there was something called the Dublin Regulation, and under that regulation, that the country where a refugee first landed had the primary responsibility for looking after that refugee. And if that refugee then made their way to a second or third country, the country to which they made their way had the right to send that refugee back to the first country. Okay?
Right.
Now, countries like Italy, where people initially landed, did not like that policy and still don't. Same with Greece. But Britain is no longer part of the EU. And so it can't do that.
That's true, yeah.
And which is one of the ironies, because immigration was a big issue in the Brexit debate, and they saying, oh, we need to take back control of our borders. Well, they effectively lost a certain amount of control of the borders by withdrawing from the EU. But the Labour government is talking to the French, or Labour Party, I should say, not government yet. Labour Party is talking to the French government about a policy whereby Britain would take a certain percentage of the refugees and take responsibility for those refugees, if France would take a certain percentage, and they're talking about roughly half of the refugees that would be sent back to them.
Oh, okay. How does that work in principle? I mean,
I have no idea. I do not know the details, and it has not been tested yet because the Labour Party is not in government.
Mm-hmm. We're almost running out of time.
Whether or not it would work, in fact, it needs to be tested.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, I mean, at the risk of sounding politically incorrect, perhaps, but is there also, apart from a racial thing, is there a religious thing involved in this whole thing as well? That Muslims come here and
there's certainly a racist element involved. That there are a lot of people who do not like people from India, Pakistan, or Africa because of the color of their skin. It mixes up with the fact they're coming from a different culture as well, and there is a fine line to be drawn between racism and xenophobia. And xenophobia, the difference problem with xenophobia, or its definition, is a fear of other cultures.
Right.
And racism is a fear based on race.
True.
And I think that a lot of people who call themselves xenophobic are probably racist. But then there are a lot of people who are just xenophobic.
Mm-hmm.
It's really difficult to tell.
True, but it's a thin line to sort of, but there somebody was telling me the other day that there are apparently no-go zones apparently in the UK where it's all Sharia law and all that stuff. Is that right?
Good grief. No. I used to do a weekly radio broadcast, and for American radio, and for a while we had a phone-in element. And these very, very right-wing people, highly conservative people, racist people, some of them there was no doubt about that, would phone in and say, I understand that Britain's cities are full of no-go areas and the Sharia laws imposed and nobody's allowed in except Muslims. And I said, well, where did you read that? Why? I'm sorry, where'd you hear that? And he said, I read it on Breitbart News. So it must be true.
Breitbart would obviously be I remember reading it somewhere.
I heard it on Fox News. It must be true. And I said, well, it isn't. Oh, you're lying. You're lying. You're just a left-wing liberal. I said, look, I live in this country. You don't. I don't. I have never seen or heard of a no-go area where the police can't go. They don't exist. Mm-hmm. If they do exist, they're probably in white working-class neighborhoods, and simply because of violence. No, right. There are no-go areas. There is an element of Sharia law amongst the Muslim community, with laws which, or not laws, but customs which apply to things like marriage and things like that, but they are not the law of the land. The law of the land is based on the British Constitution.
But you also have to sort of, look at it from another perspective, that, communities which migrate from other places tend to sort of flock together whenever they, find their own crowd.
Of course they do. I mean, I'm an American, and I have friends who are American. Most of my friends are British, to be quite honest. And there are certain things which I still do as an American. We celebrate Thanksgiving, which is a big American holiday. And every year we invite about between 20 and 30 people for a big Thanksgiving dinner. And most of them are British friends. And I stand up and give a toast and say, thank you very much like the original Pilgrim Fathers that went from England to America, the natives made them welcome. And I'm thanking you, as the natives of Britain, as someone who's come from America to Britain, for making us welcome. And they all appreciate it. And in fact, some of our British friends have started the Thanksgiving celebration themselves here in Britain as a result, which I think is...
No, I was talking about, I was talking about, you have places like Chinatown across the US. Even in India, we have Chinatowns in some cities. And we have other, areas where basically people congregate together. And that might be the reason why. Yeah. So,
Well, yes, that's always been true. I mean,
in America,
in America, people would congregate together for safety, if nothing else. I mean, I'm more familiar with American history, but here in Britain too, you had the East End of London. Was always where the immigrant community started, and you could tell the different generations of immigrant communities. You had the Hanseatic League in the Middle Ages. You had large Jewish communities for a long time. You've had, at the moment, you have large communities from Bangladesh in the East End of London, because that's where they'd first go. The ships would land there. They'd get off the ships. They'd walk straight in to a house in the East End. The house or the accommodation was arranged for them by some distant relative who was already in this country. And they also got them their first job, which was probably in the East End, nearby, and it tried to explain the system to them. And that's the way it works in every country.
Okay, last question, and let's keep it. Hopefully, you'll give me a positive kind of a thing to it. Where do you see this? Where do you see this going? I mean, looking forward, do you see it getting a lot worse, or do you see it getting better somehow, or what are your hopes as far as this particular issue is concerned?
And you want me to be positive? This is difficult, Ram. I'm sorry.
Okay, you could always say that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better, but I mean,
well, yes, okay, I'll say it's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better, because I don't think people will be tackling the core of the problem, which is the conditions in the countries from which they come, until it gets much, much worse. We have a situation at the moment. You've got a demographic time bomb, and that countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular are having a birth rate of 4.5 children per woman, whereas in Europe, I think the average is 1.2. And so, roughly by 2050, the population in sub-Saharan Africa will be double what it is now, and it will rise from roughly 10% of the world's population to 25% of the world's population. At the same time, you've got climate change, you've got wars, you've got famine. All these things are pushing these people northwards towards prosperity, survival, and Europe. It's going to continue to be a problem. And it won't be solved until we can solve the problems of the developing world.
I'm afraid, on that note, I have to close this interview. It's, such a delight to speak to you as always. And I look forward to hosting you again one of these days, and hopefully on a more positive subject, perhaps.
Or maybe we can talk about pop music or something.
Maybe. That's a good idea. Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me, Ram.
Thank you. That was Tom Arms, journalist and author in London, talking to us about the recent migration crisis in the UK and the plans to send refugees back to Rwanda. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.